Hello friends, my name is Marines and these are the 10 worst books that I read in 2022. When I do my top and bottom list, they take into account both quality and enjoyment. So these are the worst books that I did not enjoy reading. Coming in at number 10 is These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. I read this as part of House Salt's book club. This is a young adult-ish fantasy kind of retelling, sort of Romeo and Juliet. Gong takes the rival families and the star-crossed lovers element of Romeo and Juliet and she says, what if I made this lovers to enemies to lovers to enemies? And she fits all of that into her first book in this duology. And in doing so, she strips her retelling of all of the longing and angst and pining that I think is very key to the original. All of the other references to Romeo and Juliet in this felt so clunky to me, like so clunky that it was giving me secondhand embarrassment. Every time I talk about this, you can even kind of see me physically cringing because something about the way that the references were dropped like anvils in here, that they felt like so like nudge, nudge, wink, wink, really just mortified me. There were so many elements of this that had some potential, but it felt like Gong got them slightly wrong, or there was something slightly off about all of these elements. So for instance, this is YA, and I don't know why it is, honestly, other than it being a holdover of Romeo and Juliet's ages, but in every other way and functionally, it felt like this was more of an adult story. I've already talked about how much I didn't like the retelling aspect of this, but this was also very confused about its genre. It's marketed as fantasy, but the fantastical element was a complete fail to me, if it was even present here at all. Like, there's some slight magic, I guess, but it feels more like an unexplained sci-fi phenomenon than like an actual fantasy. Not that the sci-fi element was very well done either, and there is also almost a historical feeling to this. It's like alternate history 1920s Shanghai, but that wasn't super present in the story always. Like, I would forget sometimes what time period we were even in, and the sort of lack of description really took away from that historical element as well. So it was just kind of a muddle of what the story even wanted to be. There was also an attempt to flesh out the world by giving points of view to periphery characters, but that really started to drag down the story, especially because a big problem here is that I felt like Gong was sharing details and information with us that we did not need at length. She was just going into all of the weeds of some of these side characters and some of these like other moments, but the information we actually needed about characterization or the world or the mystery was all missing. So I kept feeling sort of mired and bogged down in the story, but also like I wasn't getting enough information, and that was very confusing. This also felt like a story that started in the wrong place. As I mentioned, we go from lovers to lovers to enemies in this book, but that first lovers portion really happens off screen, and because that portion of the story happens off screen, we're just told so much about their dynamic and we don't actually get to see it in practice. It just felt like through the force of sheer repetition, Gong felt like she could convince us that these two people really loved each other once and they actually really hate each other now. But the interesting thing is that like the hate to love actually read more like a miscommunication, really, because they thought one thing about the other that wasn't really true. But even in their internal monologue, it was more about the person thinking the other one hated them. I hate miscommunication, and the fact that it was like coupled with enemies to lovers here was like my own personal hell. It didn't help that I thought that these characters were very bland. Roma had no personality, and it felt like Juliet's personality was being bashed over our heads with, again, even more repetition. The actual plot of this is a mystery. But it is such a thin mystery. It is very simple, and it just feels like our characters are like running into clues accidentally, and all of these clues are pointing them in the direction of the incredibly obvious villain. By the time that we get to the end of this book, and it's clear to us that it is a circular sort of plot, and we end almost exactly where we started with nothing to show for it but the promise of like a second book that is somehow even longer, even though I felt like this first book was too long by at least 100 pages. I was so upset. I was so upset about this entire reading experience, and honestly, nothing could convince me to read the second book. I am somebody who's like down for a hate read for a lot of different things. Not even for a hate read would I read this second book. That is how absolutely uninterested I am in all of these characters or in seeing this entire thing play out a second time. Number 9 is The Near Witch by Victoria Schwab. I read this as part of a project that I'm doing where I'm reading through all of Schwab's backlist. This did feel pretty dated to me. It did very much feel like a debut, especially because it was like so generic and so derivative. It felt like YA fantasy of its time. The entire beginning setup just felt like a copy paste of the Hunger Games. The similarities end after the setup, and so does the plot. The plot really just like, I don't know, it goes away until nothing, and then it shows back up for the last couple of chapters to be like, oh yeah, or there's supposed to be a villain in this. The entire middle of the story just gets stuck in this repetitive cycle of our main character doing some light investigative work, which really just means that she kind of like wanders around the village and asks somebody a few questions, and then she's like, oh, it's getting late, it's time to go to bed. And then we watch her go home and fall asleep multiple times, and then she just wakes up the next day and does the exact same thing over again. Down to like the conversations and the arguments that she has with her mother and her uncle. They repeated multiple times in this that it really felt like a time loop to me. I felt so stuck. I was begging anybody to free me from the shackles of having to read this woman fall asleep and wake up again. There's also a romance that is thrown in here, and part of me wants to say why? Why is there a romance shoehorned in here? But the other part of me knows that without the romance, this would be even more nothing. It would just disintegrate into descriptions of the setting. So it was kind of like, I guess, I'll take the romance if I can get it, because otherwise, what is this? Romance is never going to work particularly well when you have underdeveloped characters, and that felt like the problem here. The love interest especially was like shadowy and unknown, which didn't allow for a lot of development of his character. Like, we didn't know anything about him, and before we knew it, she was like making moon eyes over him or whatnot. The main female character did have a dash of not like other girls. It wasn't very well developed because our main character doesn't interact with a lot of women, but when you look at our main character compared to all of the other women in the story, they're either sort of useless or young, or they're the witches, the sort of villains in all of this, and there is some ableism that is used to vilify them and describe them as evil. And generally, I think that this was just so focused on trying to be atmospheric and like describing the more at every turn. The setting was just described over and over and over again that Schwab forgot to like do a plot or some characterization or pace her book at all in a way that would be entertaining. Number 8 is Terms and Conditions by Lauren Asher. I read this book as part of a project to read all of the finalists in the romance category of the Goodreads Choice Awards. This is an adult romance about a billionaire and his assistant who enter into a marriage of convenience in order for the billionaire to meet the criteria of his inheritance. And this billionaire runs like a Disneyland-like sort of theme park, but don't ask me anything else about like what this business is, how it's organized, because we don't get any of that information. What we do get about the business is these like little mentions of how he treats his workers poorly and exploits them. It would just casually be like, yeah, because he doesn't pay his workers. And I was like, what in the Jesus is this? Like, I understand that when we're talking about billionaire romances, we're talking about like, somebody who got rich by the exploitation of workers, but for the fantasy to work, you can't remind me that that's how he got rich. Like, what are you doing? This was also a really badly paced romance to me because we literally get that marriage of convenience within the first few pages. So we are like, here are your characters, by the way, they're getting married. And it felt so rushed to me. At that point, I didn't even know who these characters were. I didn't know anything about them or why I should care about like this deal that they were entering into. And so we get that so fast. And then the middle of this just felt like whiplash to me because this isn't like a slow burn or a slow build of a relationship. What you quickly find out is that it's obvious, especially on the main male love interest side, is that he has feelings for this woman and he's sort of masking them and he's not coming to terms with them for himself or for her. And so we're not getting a build of feelings. We're getting like a bunch of ping-ponging of feelings. He keeps going back and forth about like, oh, this is just a business arrangement. No, I'm actually going to treat her well. No, it's just a business. And it just over and over. And I just honestly found it absolutely exhausting. So exhausting that I stopped caring about these two people. By the time we get to the end and the requisite third act breakup and miscommunication, the thing that happens is that he's exploiting her, right? So he's not treating her very well as his worker. And so they have a blow up about that essentially. So again, it was just like another reminder that this like billionaire exploits workers. And then he's like, oops, sorry, give me another try. And honestly, I'd stopped caring about them previous to that moment. But by then I was like actively angry. Number 7 is Things We Never Got Over by Lucy Score. I also read this one as part of the project where I'm reading all of the finalists for the romance category of the Goodreads Choice Awards. This is an adult romance and it is about a woman who goes to her small town to meet up with her sister and try to offer her some help. Her sister ends up like stealing from her and leaves this woman in charge of her niece. So now she's trapped in this small town. She's taking care of this niece and she meets a man there. This was a contemporary romance over 500 pages. When I made this video for TikTok, I said that this was the longest book that I read in 2022 out of 244 books that I read. That is incorrect because I read Bloodmarked in December, which is a little bit longer than this one, but it's the second longest book that I read, and it's a contemporary romance. Nothing in this book justifies the length of this book because again, it isn't a slow burn or build. This man decides that he likes her immediately, he's attracted to her immediately, and so what we're seeing is just him like being a dick to her until he eventually decides he no longer wants to be a dick to her. These characters are in their late 30s and early 40s, and I absolutely understand that maturity is different for people, and there are 40-year-olds who are very, very immature, but the thing about this is that like it felt so young to me that you could take the entire story and put this in college and make them college aged and nothing would materially change. Like you could read about these people as 18, 19, 20-year-olds and it would still be believable. I also didn't like the brand of grumpy sunshine that was here because he is grumpy to everybody, but he's actively mean to our main female character. Like he does things to her that I'm like, sir, this is like really evil, like trying to block her from having a job, even though he knows that all of her life savings were just stolen and she has to take care of a child. And the thing is that he has no reason to be mean to this woman. Like this woman did nothing to him. And what we learn is that he's acting this way because he's attracted to her. And this man at this big age doesn't know how to process his feelings. So he's just going to be mean to the girl that he likes. I literally was like, what am I reading and why? And more importantly, why is this so long? Number 6 is Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerri Maniscalco. I read this as part of a TikTok challenge. I was using a filter to basically pick books for me to read, and this was one of the books that it picked. This is a new adult fantasy about a girl whose twin sister is murdered. So she starts investigating why her sister is murdered, and it puts her in the path of like the princes of hell. And that's really all I have in terms of a plot synopsis here because the plot and the world building here were a joke. They were honestly such a joke. Our main character has like witchy power, but the use of that magic is so, I honestly cannot explain it to you at all, and neither can our main character. She somehow knows about her power, but knows nothing about her power, but can use her power, but never uses her power. She's also a really incredibly dense main character. Her function, her role in her entire story is to know nothing, and she just goes around asking people questions and nobody will share any information with her, including her own family who know more about her power than she does. And so the entire plot of this is just this character asking questions and having none of those questions answered. At the same time, she's jumping to the most wrong and the worst conclusions possible. She's just leaping to these conclusions that are honestly ridiculous to me. And the fact of the matter is that none of that really matters anyway, because what this is a romance between this 18-year-old main character and the centuries-old Prince of Hell who inexplicably falls in love with her, even though why for what reason is there an attraction there? I do not know. All of the princes of hell that we meet felt so interchangeable. They are just like cardboard cutouts of like dark, broody, evil man with like no other distinguishing qualities. The writing itself is also not very good. We're like led by the hand and spoon-fed the bits of information that we actually get, but it's not enough. So even though we're being like led step by step through this entire story, you're still in the same boat as the main character where you're like, what? Why? Who? There are no answers. Number 5 is The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. I read this as part of House Salt this year as well. If you watch back that live show, I'm kind of like, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. I spent the entire time like complaining about how bad it is, but for some reason, like I'm not fully processing how bad this is. And this has just soured so much in my feelings since I read it. This is like a young adult urban fantasy, like a new adultish urban fantasy. It is about a woman who is a clairvoyant and that power is outlawed in this world and she is sold into slavery. Honestly, those are all of the details that I retained about this plot, but also what plot. Even though this is number 5 on my list, I would give it the dubious honor of being the most boring thing that I read this year. The main character is so flat. She has absolutely no personality, and we don't get a lot of like reasoning about her decision-making process. So there were so many things that she did that were absolutely baffling to me. Like the logic was missing for me entirely. And the worst part about that is that for however flat she is, the main male love interest is worse because he's also like shadowy and secret and like playing things very close to the chest. So he's giving us nothing. She's giving us nothing. And the relationship, the romance between the two of them that is like shoehorned in at the end, honestly, I wish they hadn't. The main character is robbed of all her agency, so she exists in the story to just sort of stand around and have things acted upon her and have like information dumped onto her. I felt like all of the side characters were also incredibly flat. There were a couple that I kept mixing up because I thought they were the same person. There are so few distinguishing traits here, but also Shannon kept using the death of the side characters to try and drum up some feelings for her main character, some investment. I don't know. It was just like whenever things were getting especially slow, like some side character would kick the bucket and we were supposed to be like, aw, it didn't work. The world building itself felt very convoluted and it was so strange because we got so many info dumps in this, but at the same time we are being withheld information and so is the main character, and that's sort of how we eke out the whiff of a plot that we get here, is that nobody will tell her anything again. She doesn't know anything about the world that she's actually existing in, so her sort of being clueless and without agency is the bulk of this plot. Where we end up at the end is her being like, oh, I do trust my slave master and I would like to kiss him after all. Number 4 is Lightlark by Aster. I read this because I was involved in some discourse about the author on TikTok, and because I was like mired in that for like a week or so, I was like, well, now I'm super curious. I want to read the book. This is a new adultish fantasy about a fight to the death between some rulers in order to break the curses that are on all of their lands. The big thing that made this super unenjoyable to me was like the tonal dissonance here. So it has a lot of like the tropes of a YA fantasy. It feels very much of that ilk in that genre, sort of your generic YA fantasy, but then it wants to also include some like new adult or adult romance elements, but the writing itself and the tone and a lot of the world building elements felt middle grade. They felt very young, especially when it came to the world building elements. You have all of these like really simple naming conventions, like the sunlings live on Sun Isle and the starlings live on Star Isle and the moonlings live on Moon Isle. And you've got like these color codings to each kingdom, and then she uses some of those color codings in her names as well. It really was like, oh wow. How'd you come up with this? On top of that super simple base, we then get a very convoluted plot. It was so difficult to follow what even was happening because it just felt like things were being pulled out of a hat at random, and that was the next thing that was going to happen. So we almost immediately like jump into these games before we have any sense of character or place. She's like, okay, I'm going to this island to do this fight to the death. And then you learn it's like kind of technically only a fight to the death, like only one person has to die. Then you learn that like you can just sit out, like you can just stay at home, you don't actually have to fight at all. Then you learn that it's not really like a fight to the death at all. It is that they're like doing challenges, the weirdest, wildest challenges, like, okay, I challenge you to show your power, and then everybody just stands around and like shows their power in a way that I'm like, what are the rules here? Why is this happening? Through the middle of all of this, you have our main character just being incredibly rash and making the stupidest decisions and choices, and we just kind of spin our wheels doing that until we get to the end, and then things just like go 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 and then like it was like a betrayal, another betrayal, and things were happening so freaking quickly that it was not only wild from a pacing perspective, it just really highlighted the fact that like the characterization and the world building were so poorly done, because it felt like everything that was happening was either coming out of left field, or also I didn't care. Like, why should I care that this character betrayed her? I barely know who that character is. They've been in 2 scenes. Like, all I know about them is their color coding. So again, why should I care? The fact that we get to the end and like such a huge part of this is supposed to be the relationships that Isla has formed. It's a love triangle. So like there's a whole bit at the end that is about like the strength of a relationship she has formed. And I was like, when? Truly, where did that happen? Not in the book I read. The writing itself was pretty clunky. Like at best, it was fine. It was serviceable. And at worst, it had these really clunky descriptions. Overall, I cannot believe the amount of hate that I received in my comments, all because people were defending this book. Number 3 is It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. I read this again because of a TikTok challenge where I was using a filter to pick books for me. This is an adult, not a romance. It is marketed as a romance because the main plot core is a romantic relationship, and it does end in a happily ever after. But the thing is that Colleen Hoover is bamboozling you, because the romantic relationship that this is focusing on is actually an abusive relationship. We are watching a woman experience domestic violence, and there's like a secondary tacked on relationship that ends in a happily ever after. And so Colleen Hoover can go, it's a romance. But really the reason that this happens, and the reason that Colleen Hoover doesn't like content warnings, is because it's emotional manipulation, right? It's romanticizing the beginning of this relationship so that you're like, oh, I'm reading a romance. And then it's like, psych, it's domestic violence. So you can go, oh, domestic violence is so bad. And that's really like the depth with which she explores this topic. I find that I do not enjoy Colleen Hoover's writing. It tends to be very linear, so it's very, I did this and I did this and I did this. That's personally not a style that I frequently enjoy. I also find her plot so overstuffed. So one part of it is tragedy porn, where every character you meet has all of these like multiple traumas, which, you know, fine, that happens in real life as well, but none of them are treated with like depth or care. You get the sense that they're just being stuffed in here as part of that emotional manipulation. And the other part of it is all of these other extra elements that are like quirky. I'm just like, what? Where did this come from? So in this book, we follow our main character, and her name is like Lily Bloom Blossom or something like that, Blossom Bloom, and she runs a florist shop, and her name is Lily Blossom Bloom. We're also learning about her past through like these old, what are basically diary entries, but she doesn't just write in a diary. She writes letters to Ellen DeGeneres, and she's just like, hey Ellen, this is what happened in my day. And she's revisiting those letters, which means that we have to read the letters to Ellen. The worst thing about this, though, is that romanticizing of the beginning of the relationship here. And the thing that gets me is that actually, from the moment that we meet this character, the abuser, he's a walking red flag. We literally meet him in the middle of a tantrum where he's throwing things around. And the way that he pursues her is so manipulative and so disgusting to me that the fact that this is supposed to be like the romantic part of the story is absolutely wild. And even if you could argue that Colleen knows that it's not romantic, that is not the lens she uses. That is not how she frames it. There is so much of a traditional romance sort of framing around the early part of this book, and you can tell that that is at play with the way that people receive Colleen Hoover's stories. Everything about this either made me incredibly uncomfortable, was super weird and I can't explain it, or was incredibly problematic, and I don't understand. I don't understand what the appeal is here. Number 2 is Stormfront by Jim Butcher. This is a book that I went into genuinely prepared to love. I picked it up just for myself because I had wrapped up the In Death series. I was current on Mercy Thompson, and I was closing in on finishing Kate Daniels, so I wanted to pick up a new urban fantasy long-running series. And if you just search like best urban fantasy, Jim Butcher shows up all over the place, and so does the Dresden Files. So I was like, cool, I'll start that one. Went into it like not knowing a lot about the series at all, and just completely taken aback by how bad this was. is. This is an adult urban fantasy about a wizard named Harry Dresden who solves magical mysteries and crimes. Not a week goes by that I still don't get a comment from like a Harry Dresden bro trying to convince me that it's okay that this is rife with misogyny because it's good actually. But the thing is that even if you took out all of the misogyny from this book, it would still be like a 2-star rated book for me. Like it has the double whammy of being like just sort of mediocre and then full of misogyny, making it absolutely unbearable. I honestly don't know how I got through this. With first books in the urban fantasy series, I'm a little bit more lenient in allowing like the characterization and the world and the magic to build. But the thing that happened here was a lot of hand waving to me. Like it kept starting to explain things. Like it would say like, here's how the magic works, or here's like the certain rule or whatnot. But then it would just like either forget about that or contradict it or disregard it in some way. So it was just like, what, don't tell me rules if you're just gonna hand wave over it or like not take it into account at all. The most feeling that I felt towards the side characters was frustration with a lot of them. Like I just remember not liking most, if not all, of the side characters at one point or another. I also didn't really enjoy the mystery and the way that it was sort of investigated. I like a little bit more active investigation in my mysteries, and this felt like Harry just sort of stumbling along and lucking into clues. It removed a lot of agency from Harry. It felt like a lot of things were just sort of happening to him, or he was just kind of being dragged along by the story itself, and that wasn't helped by the fact that I really disliked Harry as a character. Of course, he's at the beginning of his arc, but I just found like his like narrative voice like super annoying. I did not want to be in his head. He had such a whiny voice. Like there was something so whiny about his narration, and there is a portion of it that was self-deprecating, or it was like the complete opposite, and he was just like boastful and like, I'm the best, I'm the most powerful, and like very little middle ground. And these are like two versions of that character that I just wanted to punch in the face a little bit, a lot. And then on top of all of that, you have the misogyny. So the whole thing is that Harry Dresden is a chauvinistic pig. He says about himself, he's just kind of like, what can I say? I'm just an old-fashioned man with some old-fashioned values. Literally because of this book and my reviews of it, I've had to explain to grown men on the internet that chivalry stops being chivalry if it is against the woman's will. If you do not have consent for something, it is no longer chivalrous to do it. So thanks, Harry Dresden. The thing about this is that it's not isolated moments in the story where you're like, okay, this portrayal of this woman is not good. Or even like a sense of like violence against women or something that permeates a little bit more. What it is like baked into Harry's narration. We have to listen to him describe women constantly and like infantilize them and over-sexualize them just constantly throughout this entire book. And it's everything again from describing the breast size of every woman he encounters to being at the scene of the crime, which is so disgusting and gross that people are throwing up, but he takes the time to describe the dead body whose chest has been blown open, but somehow he can still accurately describe the curve of her breast. So it's this stuff over and over and over and over again. And I honestly want somebody to explain to me how I was supposed to find that enjoyable. And that brings us to number 1 and the worst book that I read in 2022, and that is The Awakening by Peckham and Susanne Valenti. This is a new adultish fantasy. I really struck out with that category this year. And in it, we follow 2 twins who, when they turn 18, they find out that they are part of the Fae realm. Actually, they are 2 lost Fae princesses, and so they get ripped from their homes and taken over to the Fae realm and enrolled in this like magic college, which is really magic high school because they have detention and a principal. They get enrolled in magic not college, and their presence disturbs like the balance of power between the ruling classes that exist, and so the heirs to those ruling families take it upon themselves to bully the crap out of these sisters, and that is truly the plot. Them being bullied for hundreds of pages is all that happens. In addition to being the book that I hated the most on this list, this is also the worst written book on this list. Like the writing is truly atrocious. It was painful to try and get through this prose. It was badly edited. You couldn't ask me to point out one good thing about this, one good line, one good moment, one good piece of this at all. The entire experience hinges on our main characters being kept in the dark, but the thing is that they're like ripped from their homes, right? And they're brought over here and they're experiencing all of this abuse, but there's not a moment where I felt like they asked a logical question. There was no follow-up. There was no like, wait a second. And so that created a really terrible reading experience because it sucked all of the sense out of what was happening. No one explains anything to our main characters, and I get why like their bullies wouldn't be like, oh, here's the information that you need, but they're literally at magic school. You're telling me there's not one plot relevant lesson that they could learn here? Instead, what we constantly get is people being like, you don't know this? And it's like, no, bro, I just got here. Somebody gonna teach me? But no, nobody's gonna tell you. They're just gonna point out every single time that our main characters didn't know something. If you talk to fans of the series, they're like, no, you have to wait till like book 3 or 4 or 5 in order to get the world building or in order for this to develop some sort of romance. But what that sounds like to me is that you are agreeing that there's none of that in this book, and that makes this book really, really bad. Also, color me a skeptic that the people that wrote this book suddenly learn how to build a world and that world is just gonna show up in book 3. The world building itself was like an everything in the kitchen sink sort of world building. It was just all of these elements of magic and elemental magic and the ZODIAC and werewolves and vampires and shapeshifters and all of this stuff just sort of crammed, because really all of these are like flimsy plot props for the story that actually wants to be told here, and that is 2 barely adult Latina women being bullied by everyone around them. Their consent and their agency is violated so many times in like so many different ways. Truly, like the creativity with which these 2 authors like came up with ways to violate their consent is almost impressive, but like in the type of way that makes you a little bit nauseous. And the worst part is that the authors are doing that while also trying to convince us that there is any sort of like sexual chemistry here, or that this could be at all the beginning of a romance, or that this would be at all fun to read. Point of view switch between the 2 main characters who are twins, and they sound exactly the same. They're literally interchangeable. I had to keep going back and looking at the name at the top of the chapter to even figure out who was doing what. And truly, if you just like shook the book and all of the chapter titles like got switched around, it would change materially nothing, because all of the differences between the twins are shallow and superficial. So like one has, I think, blue hair or something, and the other one's like a little shyer or something like that, that honestly doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Nothing matters. This is hundreds of pages of badly written bullying, making it the worst book that I read in 2022. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I've mentioned, let's chat down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. I recorded this once earlier today, but I skipped a book and got so mixed up with the numbering, and I didn't even notice until afterwards, and then the sun was down, so I didn't want to record just like a few clips in the dark and a few clips in the sun. So, you know, the commitment to the bit was recording this a second time and also recording a TikTok version. But you know, the people have to know. The people have to know the books that I hated.